Hey guys, so I just wanted to demonstrate for you some different techniques that you can use for your paintings. I'm going to use the simple drawing that I made previously. Some of you all, you might have watercolors that you can use, and you can layer both of the different materials that I'm going to show you along with your regular color pencils. So I'm just going to give you a few techniques to work with. So if you have watercolors available to you, then there's two things that you can do with the watercolors. You can do what's called a wet on wet technique, where you put down water first. See that my water is a little bit dirty, so because I was using it earlier, but if your water is clean, it should be clear. You just want to make sure you see everything, but you're putting down water everywhere where you want the color to go. So if you don't want the color to go somewhere, do not put any water in that place. So I'm going to choose what color that I want for my ground, and I think I'm going to use a purple since I have some purple down on the paper already. You can make a color by putting some water in the top of your watercolor bin and mixing some colors by dropping some colors inside there. So I see I made a blue. I'm gonna make a little bit of a blue violet by mixing those together. And then I'd use this and drop it where I would want it on the page. And what you're gonna notice is that the color is going to run everywhere where you put the water down. And you, with your brush, are gonna have to control where that goes by putting down the color and then kind of moving the color right where you want it. And over here where the water is blending, but it's not going all the way to the end of the page, it's going to stop where that water ends. I'm going to drop some pure purple from the palette up here in this spot. And then I would just let this sit and dry for a little while, or you can take a blow dryer to it if it's really, really wet, or you work somewhere where it's already dry. So I can work up here a little bit where my stem is and put some color up there. So for the stem, I'm going to show you a couple different techniques in the stem. So I am going to put a little bit of color there by taking my brush, and this is called wet on dry because the paper is dry, and I'm just going to make sure that there's some paint in my brush, and I'm just going to make sure that my brush goes only where I want it to go, and I'm just going to move the paint in that area. So that's called wet on dry, and most of you guys will probably want to use that for a lot of your color if you have watercolors available to you. And notice that the more color that I put down, the darker it's going to get with the color, so be careful of that and conscious of that. So I'm gonna wash my brush out and move this color a little bit more, but I don't want it to move around a little bit so much more. I don't want too much color in that area. I have plans for that later. So I did dry my watercolor on the bottom a little bit, and so you see now how it looks now that it's dried, and I'll work on top of that a little bit later. But now let's talk about using like just different colors and putting some color onto my little gourd there. I'm going to use that wet on wet technique again for the larger parts, and then I'm going to show you how to use the watercolor color pencils for my center. So again, this has to be dry before you put a color right next to it. If it's not dry, they're going to blend together and it's going to mix, and you're not going to be very happy later. So for my little gourd here, I want it to be kind of like a bright yellow orange. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some water down, and I'm going to let the yellow and the orange meet each other in the center. So now I have all that wet down. I'm going to put my yellow in first, and I want it to be yellowish, more so right up next to these bottom lines. I'm going to put the yellow only on the one side, and I'm going to let that do what it's going to do while it's wet. I'm going to put the yellow again on this side. And again, sticking to only that area. And then the yellow is going to do what it's going to do while it's wet. Now, what fun part I can do with the watercolors is I'm going to take a little bit of orange and I'm going to put the orange on the opposite side of the yellow. And what's going to happen is the yellow and the orange are going to mix together because their wet is next to another wet. And as it dries, these colors are going to mix together and they'll have some blends, and so that might be something that you might want to do in your work. So we do that there. Put that in. And then as you see, once we get it dry again, you'll see what has happened with the colors. And I'm gonna let all that dry before I touch the other two spaces. Now for the rest of the video, I'm going to use what are called watercolor color pencils. And these are just like the color pencils that you're used to, except for you can use them like watercolors and color pencils mixed together. So I'm going to demonstrate for you how you can use these to layer over what you have already. And if this is all that you have or all that you want to use, then I'm also going to show you how you can use these just like regular watercolors. Now, if you notice on the side of watercolor color pencils, there is a brush that's usually in gold, and that is how you know that this is a pencil that's going to work the way that you're trying to use it. If there is no brush, then it's not gonna happen. So make sure that your brush or your pencils that you're using have the little watercolor brush on the side for this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you all how to create a simple pattern and how to use values of color in the background with the watercolor pencils. So I'm going to start with my pattern and I'm going to make some circles, and I'm just going to fill these in with the yellow across the space. Have my patterns. I'm going to enhance my patterns by still using the watercolor pencils. So around these yellow dots, I'm going to make a yellow-green circle, and then as I go outside towards the next dot, I'm gonna lessen up my pressure. So I'm gonna go from a pretty medium texture to a light value, probably not medium texture, but a medium value. And I'm going to get darker right when I get up next to the next circle. So I'm gonna outline that circle, and then on the outside of that, I'm gonna go from harder pressure to a lighter pressure towards the next circle, and then I'm gonna get darker again. So I'm gonna continue doing that for my whole pattern with this yellow-green.
And with watercolor pencils, a lot of the work happens during this stage when you're just kind of coloring in a space, is that you're applying the amount of pressure that you need so that you'll get a gradual change in value from light to dark. So I'm gonna do that for the whole pattern. I have all of my background filled in with the watercolor pencil, and now I'm gonna show you how the magic happens. Since I have this light yellow to yellow green, I do all of my yellow first. And what you'll notice when you go over your color pencil.
What you'll notice when you go over your color pencil is how the color moves around with your brush. So I'm gonna do all of my yellow dots first, because the paint is going to stay in the brush. And everywhere where there's a little bit of white of the paper inside of my yellow dots is now going to turn yellow. All right, so now that I have my yellow all filled in, now let's talk about what happens with the watercolor color pencils. You have to start in the lightest areas first and then go towards what is darker. So I'm gonna start here, And I want this lighter value of yellow-green to stay that yellow-green. So I'm gonna start in the middle with all of these lighter value places, and then I'm gonna work toward my darker green areas around the circles. And I can go ahead and do the whole circle, but what I need to do before I go back towards the light yellow-green is rinse off my brush and then go towards the middle and go toward that darker green. So I'm just gonna keep going from the lighter areas towards the darker areas, and after I finish a darker area, I need to wash off my brush. So now let's say that you want to add a little bit more depth in with your regular colored pencils. You can work, if you have the watercolor on the bottom, you can also work on top of the watercolor to add a little bit more definition and some value changes on top of where you have the watercolor. So let's think about this pumpkin. I can use my colored pencils and shade on the edges and just let the color kind of go away where I want the color to be deeper. And this is a good way to work in some more details. This is a way that you can kind of clean up some edges if it went a little bit, awry with the watercolors. And you can use your colored pencils on the side to add in some extra value or some extra
texture on the edges of your pieces that you have done with the watercolor. So I don't know if you can see the difference there where I put the red and the red oranges on the edges of this pumpkin. So I'm just going with the cross contours of the object and layering this in, layering the colors in on top of the watercolor. I don't have to color in the whole thing because there's that watercolor underneath. But I'm gonna work the edges so that I can kind of have these edges really pull out from that green in the background and create some more contrast. I'm gonna take my color pencils up here and add in some extra depth in the back. I'm just gonna go ahead and color a little bit of that in and going from dark to light. I'm gonna work on this area here and pulling this one outwards and making this really look round. So I think you get the idea that you can work on top of watercolor with colored pencils and layer, 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 as well as go back and forth between putting down color and layering on watercolors as well. So last little bit here on my pumpkin. Fill in some of those areas that have some white to them still. And the stem, I'm going to work in a little color on the edges here, and I'm also going to add in a little bit of details. Just stems are a little more spindly. So you can use your colored pencils to add in all those little small details that loose watercolor color painting has.